All right, so I'll say let's begin. So first of all, we dedicate our learning this morning to the four individuals murdered yesterday in the Har Nof massacre, to Rav Moshe Twersky, Rav Aryeh Kopinski, Rabbi Kalman Zev Levin, and Rav Avram Goldberg, and as well as for Refuah Shalema for Chaim Michiel ben Malka, Eitan ben Sarah, Shmuel Yerucham ben Bela, Avram Shmuel ben Shein, and Aryeh ben Bracha. And we hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas have an aliyah, and those who require a Refuah Shalema experience one. All right, so let's begin. Also, the shir is sponsored by David Kahana in memory of his father-in-law, Zev ben Shlomo. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah. Okay, so let's pick up. Today's daf is Mem Vav. We left off on Mem Hey Amud Beis. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. A lot to do today. Avdei Rabbi Chia bar Ami. Atpala lahahi ovedes kochavim l'shem insisa. So the servant of Rabbi Chia bar Ami, so literally went ahead and took a wife. She was a ovedes kochavim, a non-Jew, and he had her go to the mikvah for insisa. So if you look at Rashi, etpala l'shem insisa, l'shem tevilas nida, v'lo tevilas gerus. So he had her go to the mikvah ultimately again for the purpose of nida, for purifying her from nidos, but not for the sake of conversion. What's interesting over here, of course, is remember the laws of Nida do not apply ultimately to non-Jews, but will apply in certain respects, depending on the circumstances, to avadim, to servants, slaves owned by Jews. So the Eved went ahead and had the woman go ahead and go to the mikvah for Nida purposes. Rav Yosef said, so apparently she gave birth to a daughter. Rav Yosef said, I could go ahead and show you how she is kosher, and her daughter's kosher. How so? Kidravasi, the Amravasi, Milo Tavla Lenidusa. Kidravasi. So how could I show that she is kshera? Like Ravasi, how could I show that she is kshera? Like Ravasi, what did Ravasi say? Milo Tavla Lenidusa. Because Ravasi said, did she not go ahead and be tovel for her nidus? Look at Rashi, last Rashi on the daf. Milo Tavla Lenidusa. Va'osa Tvila, Ola Tvilas Geros. The Das Yehudisi, V'chein mi lo tavla kerbos is actually very interesting. Rabbi Asi says that she's Jewish. Why is she Jewish? Because since she went to the mikvah for the purpose of Nida, and since the halachos of Nida is part of the Torah, if she's going ahead and she's toveling for Nida, then chances are what? That means that she's accepting upon herself Judaism. So we'll say, this of course is very dramatic, because Ravasi essentially is allowing for a circumstantial conversion. The fact that she went to the mikvah for Nida, and Nida is one of the halachos that a Jewess has to keep, indicates to us that her immersion for Nida is in fact an immersion for the sake of conversion. Hahu dikari, and again, ve'eved haba bastravlad kasher. So that's why she herself, the servant, will be kshera, and her daughter will be kshera. Why? Because he holds that a Jewish woman that has a child with a non-Jewish man, such a child is kasher. Okay. Hahu dikar have a karile bar armiasa. There was a man who they used to call him the son of the Aramean. In other words, there was a man who they said his father was not Jewish. So the Gemara said, Amravasi, Milo Tavla Lenidusa. So again, they said his mother was not Jewish. So Ravasi said, is that possible? After all, again, I'm sure that his mother at some point in time went to the mikvah for the sake of Nida, and because of that, again, like Ravasi's shita is, that Lamaisa, that type of circumstantial immersion is enough to affect conversion, which I will say we're going to get it, the conversion sugya, it's actually the next sugya. So we'll see when we could apply such a concept like this and when we can't. Hahudi have a karile bar Aramah. There was a man who they used to call the son of the Aramean, meaning they said that his father was not Jewish. Amr Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Milo Tavla L'Kario. Did he not at some point in time go to the mikvah for the sake of kari, for the sake of a seminal emission? So once he went to the mikvah for the sake of a seminal emission, again, that would be good enough to go ahead and affect his conversion as well. But I will say, obviously, you're talking about people over here who already conducted themselves as Jews. So the point over here that the people were raising is that they ever go through a formal conversion process. To which the Gemara is saying is that if people are already conducting themselves as Jews, we know that they went to the mikvah at some point in time for the sake of halacha, and therefore again that halachic immersion, although it was not for the express sake of conversion, Lamaisa should be good enough to go ahead and affect conversion. Amar Chabar Goria Amarav. Halokeach eved mina oved kochavim is actually an interesting case. If one purchases a slave, a servant from a non-Jew, so this is talking about purchasing a non-Jewish servant from a non-Jewish owner. So what's that? V'kadam v'tava l'shem ben chorin, and then what happens? Rabbi say before the Jew is able to fully take ownership, and we'll go ahead and we'll define this. The servant, the slave, jumps into the mikvah and goes ahead and immerses for the sake of converting. Kana atzmo ben chorin. That's what it means when it says v'tava l'shem ben chorin. He tovels himself for the sake of ben chorin. Of a free man, it means he tovels himself for the sake of becoming Jewish. Kana atzmo ben chorin. He has acquired himself. In other words, if he converts before the Jewish master is able to take full ownership, then l'maisa he has acquired himself. My timer. What's the reason? Top of men bava madalif. Ovid kochavim gufa lo kanile, because an ovid kochavim, a non-Jew, when he owns another non-Jewish servant, ultimately has not acquired a guf, meaning he doesn't have shlita over the body of the servant. What does he have? Essentially, if you look at Rashi says over here, Ovid kochavim lo kano legufo shel zeh mitrila k'damar lekamon v'im lo hayu konim zeh zeh. So we'll say we will see that essentially when a non-Jew owns a non-Jewish servant, essentially what he owns is the productivity of that particular servant. But lamaisa, again, he does not own the guf. Because of that, my dekani lehu demakni le'Yisrael, whatever he owned, he's able to convey to the Jew. Meaning, so at first approach, the only thing that he's conveying to the Jew is what we call is some level of rights over his productivity. Therefore, because the Jew does not yet own the guf, the body of the Eved, since now the Eved jumps into the mikvah and immerses himself for the sake of becoming a free man, i.e. a Jew, therefore the lien or the shibud, the lien or the rights that the Jewish master has, ultimately go away. Kidrava. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. Amar Rava hekdish chametz v'shichrur mafkiyin midei shibud. Because Rava says, Rabbi, say that there are certain things that remove a lien from an item, and they are hekdish, consecrating something, chametz, something becomes chametz, shichrur, emancipation. I will say, so the way Rashi explains this case over here is we're talking about over here what we call an apotiki. An apotiki means if I borrow money from Ruvain and essentially I give collateral. I collateralize something, and I say that ultimately, if I can't pay the debt, so that item over there, we'll call it that ox. Fine. This watch will go ahead and become the source of your repayment. And then let's say I go ahead and I makdish the watch. I consecrate it for the temple. So what happens when you consecrate something? Consecration removes any pre-existing liens. So therefore, again, it becomes property of the Beis Hamikdash. Similarly, again, if I were to go ahead and say I have a very expensive loaf of bread, if I can't go ahead and pay back the debt, you could go ahead and take my loaf of bread, and then what happens? Pesach comes. Once Pesach comes, there's an Isser on Chametz, assuming I didn't sell it to a non-Jew. So Pesach comes, turns that into Chametz. Ultimately, the halacha is that once something becomes Chametz, it becomes removed from all potential use, and therefore the lien goes away as well. And Shichrur. And ultimately, again, when an Eved becomes emancipated, that removes any and all liens from him as well. So the Gemara says, massive Rav Chisda is the kasha. So based on this, all we're saying over here is a very interesting idea. When a non-Jew owns a non-Jewish servant, bless you, he does not own the guf, he does not own the body of the servant. As opposed to when a Jew owns an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish servant, the Jew owns the guf. We'll discuss where we get that from. The Jew owns the guf, which means that at the point of transition from the non-Jew to the Jew, technically speaking, if the Eved were to jump into the mikvah and convert, then technically speaking, he has acquired himself for himself, and the Jew loses out. So the Gemara is Zakasha. Maser Rav Chisda is Zakasha. Maser Bibeloria Hagiores Shekadmu Avadeha V'Tavel Lefaneha. There was once a situation of Beloria, who herself was a convert. That what happened at the time that she was converting, her servants, her slaves, jumped into the mikvah and what? And converted before her. They converted before her. Uba ma'asa lefnei chachamim, and the rabbis, and this episode came before the rabbis, va'amru, and they said, kadmu atzman b'nei chorin, that ultimately what? That the servants have acquired themselves as free men, to which the Gemara says, lifaneha in, la'achareha lo, Now, interestingly enough, the reason why this seems to work is why? Because they were converting before her. But had they converted after her, it would not work. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Beloria lefaneha in, lefi shein gerim, v'ovedes kochavim, va'ovid kochavim lo kani legufei. Because again, if they converted before her, that means they became Jewish, she's non-Jewish, therefore again they have the ability to go ahead and take possession of themselves. But had she converted first, Rashi says, Lachareha lo, alma gabi Yisrael lo amrinan kana evet atzmo ben chorin. So you see from here that what? That once the slave is owned by the Jew, that lemaisa again, he cannot acquire himself as a free man. To which the Gemara says, no, let's qualify this. Amarava, lefaneha, bein bistam bein b'mefurash. Rava says like this: if they converted before Beluria, so when they immerse themselves in the mikvah, whether they explicitly articulated that they are doing so for the sake of becoming free men or not, lemaisa they go ahead and Bein bistam bein b'mefurash. They go ahead and they acquire themselves. Lachareha, however, if they're toveling in the mikvah after she converted, b'mefurash in bistam lo. If they explicitly say we're immersing ourselves in the mikvah for the sake of becoming free men, i.e. Jewish, then lemaisa again the tvila works. But if they did not explicitly articulate, then it would not work. Amar Rav Avia, lo shanu ella below kech mina ovei kochavim. So this whole discussion of a slave being able to go ahead and acquire himself is only talking about a situation where a Jew is purchasing the slave from the non-Jew. Because at that point in time, as we said before, the non-Jew has only acquired what we'll call productivity or output of the slave, has not acquired the actual guf of the Eved. Aval ovit kochavim gufei kani. We'll say, now what does this mean? Look at Rashi. Aval ovit kochavim gufei, ovit kochavim shemachar atzmo liyisrael, a non-Jew who sold himself to a Jew, kano liyisrael legufei. The Jew has actually acquired has actually acquired his body. Vim kadam v'tava l'shem ben chorin, lo kana asmo ben chorin. So we'll say, interestingly enough, when a Jew acquires a non-Jew as a servant, l'maisa the Jew owns the entirety of the non-Jew, that actually owns the body, and therefore l'maisa if the non-Jew were to try to go to the mikvah in order to go and become ben chorin, such a situation would not work. Why? Because he does not have shlita, he does not have full control over his own physicality, therefore he does not have the ability to change his status. Where do we get this from? So the Gemara says, where do we get this idea that if a Jew owns a non-Jewish servant, he owns lemaisa his guf? Dichsiv v'gam b'bnei atoshavim hagarim imachem mehem tiknu, because the pasuk says, from literally the sons of the residents, right, who live within you, referring to the Gentile nations within Canaan, mehem tiknu, from among them you should go ahead and acquire. The Gemara is talking about over here that it's better to acquire a non-Jewish servant than it is to acquire a Jewish one. So mehem tiknu, from them you shall acquire. Atem konim mehem, you could acquire from them, i.e. if you take a non-Jewish servant, so l'mayis, again, remember, you acquire the guf of the servant, vehem lo konim mikem, but they cannot acquire your guf. Velo heim konim zemizeh, furthermore, again, they cannot acquire the guf of one another. They cannot acquire the guf of one another. So we'll say, the point the Gemara is making over here, from the pasuk we see that the only time that a master acquires the guf of the servant is when? Is in a case of where a Jew is purchasing a non-Jewish servant. But in any other case of servitude, either the Gentile is the master, the Jew is a servant, or Gentile to Gentile, in all of those cases, there's not a kinyan aguf. What the master does not acquire the body, he just simply acquires the productivity. The say the nafkamina would be, again, in the case of where the Eved goes ahead and tries to go to the mikvah to free himself. In a case of a Jewishly owned servant, it would not work because the Jew owns the guf, but on the other cases, it technically could work. So the Gemara says, velo heim konim mekem, so they cannot acquire from you, meaning that a non-Jew who owns a Jewish servant does not acquire the guf. So the Gemara says, Lamai, what does that refer to? If you say that the Gentile master does not acquire the earnings or the productivity of the Jewish servant, is that true? I mean, it's not true. Is it true that you're trying to say that a Gentile master will not acquire the masei yadayim, the output or not output? Okay, The productivity, okay. What he produces with his hands, he's saying that the Gentile master would not acquire that. That's not true. V'haksiv, ola eker mishpachas ger. Torah speaks about explicitly the idea that a Jew can be sold if a Jew is sold to a non-Jewish master. V'amar mar mishpachas ger zeh oved kochavim. So you see over here that a Jew can be sold to a non-Jewish master. What is the Jew being sold for? Bepashtos maaseh yadayim elalav legufei. Rather, we mean is that the non-Jewish master can never acquire the actual guf of the Jew. The Ka'amar Rachmana, and the pasuk says, "Atem konem mehem afilu gufei." So therefore, Rabbi said the novelty in the ruling is that the way the Torah sets it up is that the Jewish master could acquire the guf, could acquire the body of the Gentile servant, but the reverse is not true. When a Gentile master acquires a Jewish servant, he only acquires the ma'aseh yadayim and not the actual guf. Parich Rav Acha. Rav Acha raised the kasha, and he said again, maybe Ema bekaspo betfila, maybe lemaisa, the only way you acquire ultimately is both with money as well as with tefillah, to which the Gemara says kasha. Indeed, that is a good kasha. Look at Rashi. Ema bekaspo betfila, l'shum avdusu dekamar rachmana likni, avalim kadam v'tava l'shem ben chorin, hachanami de ben chorin. So Rav Acha is raising the point, maybe the only time that a Jew fully acquires a non-Jewish servant is both when there is kaspa, when there is money, and tefillah l'shem avdus. But before either of these processes, both of these processes are complete, if the non-Jew were to jump into the mikvah for the sake of conversion, he would indeed acquire himself. To which the Gemara says, kasha. You know what? It is a good question. Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel says, v'tzarach l'tokfo b'mayim. Well, this is actually very interesting. Shmuel says that in order, when you, now I'll say, what the Gemara did not explicitly say here, but it's understood from the context, is that when a Jew acquires a non-Jewish servant, there's something called tvila l'shem avdos. There's an immersion in the mikvah for the sake of servitude. Because remember, again, when a Jew takes a non-Jewish servant to it, that servant, it's a strange thing in halacha, because normally being Jewish is kind of an all or nothing, with the exception of a servant. A Gentile servant, upon becoming the servant of a Jew, is immersed for the sake of servitude, and that immersion gives him the status of a quasi-Jew. He's already chayiv in certain mitzvahs from the time of that immersion. So Rav Ashi brings out, Shmuel says something very interesting over here, which is that when you do that immersion for the sake of avdos, you have to be careful. Why? Because you have to show that it's done for the sake of servitude and not what? And not for the sake of freedom, i.e. becoming Jewish. Because if he goes in and takes advantage of that tefillah, ultimately he becomes Jewish, and you have just lost, it might be a benefit for Klal Yisrael, but you have just lost your servant. So therefore Shmuel says that when you immerse him for the sake of Avdos, that immersion itself must have some type of demonstration of servitude. Look at Rashi. When you immerse him for the sake of Jewish servitude, you have to give him some type of act of servitude already in the water, Tvilas avdos, in order that it looks like, that it's clear contextually that he is immersing for the sake of servitude. So it has to be so apparently clear that the servitude is for the sake that the immersion is for the sake of servitude, that even if he says, no, I did it for the sake of becoming Jewish, it's clear from the context that is not true. So the Gemara says, Kiha di Minyamin avdei de Ravashi. Listen to this, because like the case of Minyamin, who was the servant of Ravashi, ba'o la'atvule. He went ahead and so Ravashi needed to immerse him for the sake of servitude. Masri nehelayu l'Ravino l'Ravacha b'rei de Rava. So what happened? So Ravashi gave Minyamin over to Ravina and to Rav Acha, the son of Rava, in order to immerse him for the sake of Avdus. Amar Lahu, and Ravashi said, Chazu diminaychu kabois. If something goes wrong over here, and he ends up converting, I'm coming after you guys. Meaning, in other words, that if he pulls shtick with this conversion, with this immersion, and he ends up converting, you are going to be financially liable to me for the sake of the loss of my servant. So what did they do? Ramule arvisa bitzavarase. So I'll say, okay, so this wouldn't exactly be politically correct. So what did they do? They went ahead and they put a leash on his neck. So what did they do? On the servant Aminyamin's neck. So what did they do? Arpule, they loosened it. Vitsamtsmule, and they tightened it. Arpule, they loosened it. Why? In order that the water should be able to get to every part of Minyamin. Tsamtsmule, They tightened it in order that he not make the statement that I am going ahead and immersing myself for the sake of becoming a free man. The idea, Rabbi say, is that the tightening of the leash was clearly a demonstrative act of servitude, so that it was clear contextually that lemaisa, the act of immersion, was for the sake of servitude. So and furthermore, as soon as Binyamin lifted his head up from the water, they placed the bucket of cement on his head, and they said to him, Amtu lebei marach, go ahead and take this to the house of your master. So Mamish, as he's coming up from the water, they already literally put upon him an act of servitude, in order that there should be no possibility of him declaring himself that this immersion was done for the sake of his freedom/Judaism. Amrli Rav Papa Rava. Rav Papa said to Rava, Chazimar, Hani debe Papa bar Abba, Diyahave Zuze le'inshi le'kargaihu, u'mishabdi behu, kinafki tzricha gita dechirusa olos. Well, it's actually a very interesting case. So Rav Papa said to Rava, these people from the house of Papi bar Abba. Now, what happened to Papi bar Abba? So in the times of Papi bar Abba, there was a head tax. The king imposed the head tax. If you did not go ahead and pay your head tax, you became a slave to the king. So Papi bar Abba, now this is talking about non-Jews in his locale. If there were non-Jews who could not go ahead and pay the head tax, he paid the head tax for them. And as a result, he took them as his own servants, Mishabdi Bahu. Now Rav Papa is asking Rava, when these guys go out from their servitude, now when they go out from their servitude, after they worked off the amount of the head tax, so after they went out of their servitude, do they need a get shichror or not? Right? Do they need a document of emancipation? Meaning, is this considered essentially what Rav Papa is asking Rava is what they're doing in the house of Rav Papi, is it appropriate or not? Is it legal what they're doing? So Amalei, so Rava responded, Amalei Eicho, I'm sorry. Amalei, I'm sorry. Amalei, Echo shechiv, Iko shechivi lo amri lechu hamels. This is very interesting. So Rava said to Rabba, it's a good thing you asked me, because had I died, I would not have been able to answer. I will say, so apparently, what does that mean? So apparently, again, we'll say Rava was already older at this point in time. So Lamaisa, what Rava is saying to Rabba is, I'm so happy you asked me. I never taught this halacha. I'm so happy you asked me this, because now I could tell it to you before I died. I will say, understand, once upon a time, Torah Shebal Peh was Baal Peh, which meant that if a Rebbe died and did not go ahead and give over all of his knowledge, that knowledge went with him to the grave. So Rav is almost like expressing gratitude towards Rav Papa. I realize I never taught this halacha, so thank you for asking me the question. Now I know that before I leave this world, I've given over this information. So what happens? So Rav Sheshes said, Moharkaihu dahani bitafsa de malka manach. Literally, Rabbi say moharkaihu means the seal of servitude. The seal of servitude for these individuals rests bitafsa, in the chest of the king. Umalka Amar, and the king said, Man de lo yoev karga mishtabed leman de yoev karga. Well, so in other words, what Rav Sheshes was saying was, this is actually part of the rule of the kingdom. That the king said that if somebody cannot pay their head tax and someone else pays the head tax for them, that the person who paid the head tax owns the individual who could not pay, or whom he paid on his behalf. So therefore, essentially what Rav Sheshes is saying is, what they're doing in the house of Rav Papi is absolutely legal, and it's actually part of the statutes of the kingdom. Okay. Rav Chia bar Abba ikla legabla. Rav Chia bar Abba went to Gavla was a city. Chaza benos Yisrael Avron migin. And I will say, now we're going to get into the sugya. We're going to begin to get into the sugya of conversion, which is really interesting. So what happens? Rav Chia bar Abba went to the city of Gavla, and he saw that there were Jewish girls. Avron megerim shemalu velo tavlu. And he said there were Jewish women married to men who had converted, but interestingly enough, they had done bris milah, but never went to the mikvah. They never had an immersion for the sake of conversion. Okay, that's number one. He also saw that there was Jewish wine that was being diluted by Gentiles. Meaning, again, I will say that what happened, you have to dilute wine concentrate. So there was Jewish wine concentrate. The dilution was done by non-Jews, and yet Vishasu Yisrael. But yet the Jews would still go out and drink the wine. Okay, the chazu turmisin, the shalki of the kocham va'achli Yisrael, and he saw turmisin. I will say turmisin is a type of lentil that requires extensive cooking. So he saw turmisin that was cooked by non-Jews, and yet Jews would still eat it. V'lo amar lahu v'lo midi, but yet Rav Chiya bar Abba, and we'll see why, did not say anything to these individuals. Also, so Rav Chiya bar Abba came before Rabbi Yochanan. He told him what he saw. Amar le, Rabbi Yochanan said, say, v'hachriz al benim shehim mamzerim, go out and announce that the children of Gavla ultimately again are mamzerim. Again, I will say we'll see why that is. Va'al yenam mishum yayin nesach, and ultimately that their wine is yayin nesach. Va'al turmisin mishum bishuli ovdei kochavim, and say that the turmisin is bishul akum. Bishul akum, I will say we know that there is a prohibition, actually very important halacha, a prohibition to go ahead and eat food that is cooked by non-Jews. This has nothing to do with ingredients. Nothing to do with ingredients. Has to do with, again, we'll see this in Avodah Zarah, a number of gezeros that were enacted by the rabbis in order to prevent too much of a social interaction. One of them, ultimately, again, is that we may not go ahead and eat food cooked by non-Jews. We will say, you'd be surprised, this is halacha that sometimes people are unaware of, especially if a person has maybe a non-Jewish cleaning lady or a housekeeper that a person allows to do certain things around the house. You have to be very careful because literally a non-Jew is not permitted to cook for a Jew. Obviously, there are circumstances where that is permitted, but just so you understand that Bishul Akum is so serious that according to most poskim, that if a non-Jew cooks food for a Jew in Jewish utensils, according to many poskim, that those utensils have to be kashered. Literally have to be kasher in the same way that if one cooked treif in those utensils. So therefore again, Rabbi Yochanan is saying over here that this is bishul akum, that the Gentile cooked the turmisin, therefore you're not permitted to go ahead and eat it, bishul akum. So let's understand. Ulefi she'inon b'nei Torah. Why? And this is all because the people of Gavla are clearly not b'nei Torah. Look at Rashi. Rashi is over here, Lefi she'inon b'nei Torah, at turmisin koi. Now we're going to qualify this statement before. What does this mean? Does this mean that Rabbi Yochanan is saying all of this because they're not B'nai Torah? Rashi says that the B'nai Torah piece specifically refers to the Turmisin. We're going to define that in just a moment. So I will say now the Gemara is going through each of these. Number one, Rabbi Yochanan said B'nai Shem Mamzer. So remember, Rabbi Yochanan said that the Jewish women of Gavla were married to men, to converts, who had a bris milah, but did not go ahead and immerse in a mikvah. So Rabbi Yochanan declared the children mamzerim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei, the Amar Rabbi Chibar, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, li'olam ein ger, because they both say Rabbi Yochanan holds that a person is not considered to be a convert until he has both milah and tvila. You need circumcision and immersion. So essentially, a person who went out and had circumcision but did not have immersion is not Jewish. Furthermore, now since he has not immersed himself, so therefore he's not Jewish, he's a non-Jew. So we'll say, essentially what you have is the confluence of two different shitos that create a very negative result. Number one, he holds that in order to convert you need milah and tvila, and if you only have one, then lemaisa, again, you are not considered to be Jewish as much as you've started the process. So now these men are not Jewish. Furthermore, he holds that if a non-Jewish man fathers a child with a Jewish woman, that child is a mamzer. Therefore, the children of Gavla ultimately are mamzerim. Next, va'al yenam mishum yayin nesach, and their wine is considered to be yayin nesach. Now, we'll say, the interesting part about this is the following. If you look at Rashi, first wide line, Rashi says over here, "Da'afa gav delo nogi ela koho ba'almahu asa mishum l'chalach hamin on nazir." I will say, I want to point something out. Remember, bless you, in this case, the non-Jews are not actually touching the wine. What are they doing? They're pouring water into the wine. They're not actually touching the wine. So technically speaking, this should not be yayin nesach. Yayin nesach only comes up if a non-Jew touches the wine. To which the Gemara says, you're right. But since over here, when they pour the water, they are displacing the wine, meaning they're causing the wine to move. L'cha l'cha amrina l'nazira, sechar sechar lekarma. So we'll say this is an expression that we have, that to the Nazir, who's not permitted to go ahead and drink wine, we tell him go around the vineyard. Essentially, don't cut through the vineyard, even though you're not doing anything wrong by cutting through it, go around. In other words, it's another way of saying that sometimes we try to distance ourselves from circumstances in which we could ultimately get into trouble down the road. So therefore, again, Rabbi Yochanan is concerned that if we allow the non-Jew to go ahead and dilute the wine, the people of Gavla, who themselves seem to be ignorant individuals, will allow the non-Jew to touch the wine later on. Therefore, better to declare the wine now yayin nesech to prevent it from actually coming to isurim later on. Va'al turmasin mishum b'shulei ovdei kochavim. And ultimately, we said that they can't. Rabbi Yochanan said they can't eat the turmasin because it's bishalakum, it's food cooked by a non-Jew. And remember, he ended off by saying lefi she'enan b'nei Torah. Why can't they eat the turmasin? Because they're not b'nei Torah. Ha b'nei Torah shari. So you're trying to tell me that if they were b'nei Torah, the turmasin would not be a problem? Yet Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said the name of Rav. It's actually halacha l'maisa. Anything that can be eaten raw is not subject to the laws of bishul akum, because since again l'maisa the object can be eaten raw anyway, the act of cooking is not considered to be such value added to the product, and therefore again it's not subject to bishul akum. But yet again, tormas cannot be eaten in a raw state, and therefore v'yesh bo mishum bishul odei kochavim. So I don't understand, what does it have to do that the people of Gavla are b'nei Torah, not b'nei Torah? Either way, if a non-Jew cooks tormasin, the tormasin should what? Should be also because of bishul akum. It can't be eaten raw. To which the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Yochanan kidach lishna sirlei. Rabbi Yochanan holds like the other lashon. What's the other lashon? Lam Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak mishmei derav kol she'ein ola ashulchan melachim le'echal bo'as hapas ein bo mishum bishuli ovdei kochavim. Rabbi said because Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak says in the name of Rav that any food that is not fit for a king's table is not subject to laws of bishul akum. The Rabbi say bishul akum doesn't apply to every single food. It only applies to chashiv foods, to important foods. What's the definition of a chashiv food? Something that a king would serve at his table. And what does that mean? The idea is saying is that a person would consider to be himself a chashiv item. It's not subjective, by the way, it's objective. Therefore, again, I'll both say, technically speaking, using this logic, what should be the halacha with turmasin? So apparently, turmasin were not considered to be a very important food. Therefore, using this parameter, so turmasin should not be subject to the laws of bishul akum. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan said, "V'taiman de'ena b'nei Torah." The only reason we're saying it is bishul akum is because we're afraid that the people of Gavla, if we let them use turmasin cooked by a non-Jew, they will end up having other foods cooked by a non-Jew. So because they are b'nei Torah, they are not b'nei Torah. We have to even make the turmasin illegal. Ha b'nei Torah shari. But again, if they were b'nei Torah but just made a mistake, and you could educate them to avoid the mistake in the future, we would have told them the turmasin are mutar. But again, I will say, obviously, Rabbi Yochanan was really saying over here is that the people of Gavla just are ignorant individuals, and you have to be concerned that if we don't create certain gedarim, they're going to violate halacha even more. Therefore, he said the turmasin are asur. So we'll say a lot that came out of this sugya, a lot of halacha. But now the Gemara is going to use this sugya as a springboard for a discussion about conversion. Because remember, what came up over here was the interesting case of the men of Gavla, the converts of Gavla, who did bris milah, but did not do tevilah. And clearly Rabbi Yochanan ruled that milah without tevilah is not effective conversion. Tana Rabbanot. Now the Gemara is going to discuss this. Ger shemal v'lo taval, if you have a convert who did bris milah but didn't immerse in the mikvah, Rabbi Elazar says, harei ze ger. Rabbi Elazar says it's a conversion. Now again, Rabbi Elazar is not saying you shouldn't do tevilah also. You should do tevilah also, but lamaisa, right after you did milah, you are Jewish. Why we have historical precedent? What's the historical precedent? Our forefathers that did milah and did not go to the mikvah. Now, what forefathers is he referring to over here? Look at Rashi. Bavasinu Shemalu, second line. Bimei Moshe. When we left Egypt, remember, one of the things we had to do before we left Egypt was what? Was bris milah. So Rabbi Elazar understands that bris milah ultimately was an entry into the covenant of God. So you see historical precedent for just milah affecting conversion. Okay. Shemalu v'lo tavlu. Taval v'lo mal. What happens again, lemaisa, if you just did tevilah, but you did not do, so you did immersion but not circumcision? Rabbi Yeshua Zaharei Zeger. Rabbi Yeshua says such a conversion works. So, okay, interesting. Where does he get that from? Well, this is very interesting. Shekin matzinu be'imos shetavlu v'lo malu. Because we find it with literally our imos, our matriarchs, that they immersed and did not do bris milah. Okay, so the Gemara says over here, Be'imos, Rashi says, Nishosehem shetavlu kidim afarish lekaman dimlo tavlu b'man nichnesu tachas kanfei shkin. And this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Yoshua says over here, that Lamaisa, it must have been that the women at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim must have immersed in a mikvah, must have immersed in a body of water, because how else did they enter into the covenant of God? If the men were doing milah, the women had to have done something also, so they must have done immersion. So you see over here that just like they did immersion, no circumcision, obviously, that immersion by itself works as well. The Chachamim say, no, you're both wrong. Taval v'lo mal v'lo taval, eina ger at sheyimal v'yitbol. On the other hand, the Chachamim say they disagree with both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua. So remember, you have Rabbi Elazar saying that Milah by itself is enough, claiming historical precedent. Rabbi Yoshua saying Tevilah is enough, claiming historical precedent. And the Chacham saying, no, in order to become Jewish, you need both Milah and Tevilah. Rabbi Yoshua nami neilif me'avos. Why doesn't Rabbi Yoshua, who says that Tevilah is enough, why doesn't he learn out from the forefathers that you also require, from our ancestors, that you also require Milah? Rabbi Elazar nami leilif me'imos. And why doesn't Rabbi Elazar also learn out that Tevilah is enough from our female ancestors? The chitema, maybe he'll say, ain't done in efshar mishi efshar. And I will say, maybe he'll say there's a very simple reason why you can't learn out from the emos, because that's ridiculous. It's strange to say that we're going to learn out that there's not an obligation of milah for conversion purposes from the emos, from our female ancestors who obviously didn't have the ability for milah. So the Gemara says that's what it means. V'chite, maybe you'll say, ain't done in efshar mishi efshar. You can't go ahead and learn out a case of possibility from a case where it's not possible. V'atanya, we learned, Rabbi Elazar says, Minayin lePesach doros she'in ba ela minachulin. Rabbi say, how do we know that Karban Pesach in future generations can only come from chulin money? Rabbi say, now what does this mean? Let's say I have Meiser Sheni money. Remember, what is Meiser Sheni money? Meiser Sheni money is consecrated money that has to be spent in Yerushalayim. So I figure, great, I have to bring a Karban Pesach anyway. Let me just go ahead and bring my Karban Pesach from Meiser Sheni money. So how do we know that you are not permitted to do that? But Meiser Sheni could, but Pesach could only come minachulin, from unconsecrated funds. So the Gemara says, we learned that how? Ne'amar Pesach Mitzrayim. Ne'amar Pesach b'Mitzrayim. It says the word Pesach by Mitzrayim, right? By the Pesach Mitzrayim. V'ne'amar Pesach b'Doros, and you use the same word Pesach for future observances also. Ma Pesach Omer Mitzrayim ein bo ela minachulin. Ma Pesach Omer Mitzrayim ein ba ela minachulin. Just like by Pesach of Mitzrayim, the original Pesach, it had to be brought from unconsecrated funds. Rabbi say why? Because there was no such thing as Meiser Sheni. Av Pesach Omer Ladoros ein ba ela minachulin. So to Pesach for all future generations also can only be brought from unconsecrated funds as well. Amrli Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, what are you talking about? The chidon and efshar mishei efshar. How can you even compare those cases? Of course, Pesach Mitzrayim didn't come from Meiser Sheni funds because there was no such thing as Meiser Sheni yet. So how can you compare that to future generations? So to which he responds, Amrli afa pishi efshar. Even though you're right in Pesach Mitzrayim, there was no ability for Meiser Sheni. Nevertheless, raya gidolihi v'nil mod himena. Nevertheless, it's a good raya, and we could learn it. In other words, I will say that even though the cases do not line up exactly, nevertheless, we can use Pesach Mitzrayim as a paradigm for future generations. So, so from here you see that sometimes you can make comparisons between things, even if they have obvious dissimilarities. Ella, rather, Amud Beis, V'tava v'lo mal kuli amalo pligi dimahani. Rather, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that everyone would agree that if a person immersed in the mikvah but did not do milah, everyone agrees that what? Dimahani. Everyone agrees that such a conversion would be good. Now I will say everybody agrees at this point over here. Not everybody agrees. But if the Gemara is suggesting that for just a moment, ki pligi, perhaps when do they argue? Bimal v'lo taval. Maybe the only time they argue is when they was. So I will say, so again, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that Lamaisa, if I could use our female ancestors as a paradigm for conversion, what that teaches me is what? Is that Lamaisa, immersion in a mikvah by itself is enough to affect conversion. So Lamaisa, now I could say with absolute certainty, says the Gemara, although there's not going to be Pascal Halacha Lamaisa, that if somebody immerses, even if they didn't yet do Milah, that Lamaisa they're Jewish. So keep pligi. When does the Machlokes come up? B'ma v'lo taval, in a case of circumcision without immersion. Rabbi Eliezer Yalef Me'avos. Rabbi Eliezer learns it out from the ancestors and from our male ancestors, and says what? Just like they needed Milah, so too there is no conversion without Milah. Rabbi Yoshua, Ba'avos nami tevila hava. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, the truth is, even our forefathers, it wasn't their circumcision that affected their conversion. Rather, what was it? It was their immersion in the mikvah. So the Gemara says, Minalei, how do you know that our forefathers, that our ancestors, immersed in the mikvah? Listen to this. Because the pasuk says, Leich ela'am. So this is talking about by Matan Torah, by Har Sinai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, go to the people, v'kidashtem hayom umachar, and consecrate them, sanctify them today and tomorrow, v'kipsu simlosam, and have them also. Now, kipsu simlosam literally means have them launder their clothing. Now, the way the Gemara is understanding this is what? Well, actually, the Gemara says, Uma b'makom she'in ta'on kibus, ta'on tvila. I will say, even in circumstances where you don't require immersion of clothing, you require immersion of the body. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. B'makom shein ton kibus kigom bal keri. Let's say a man has a seminary mission. So the halach is he must immerse his body in the mikvah, but he need not immerse his clothing. See, even in circumstances where you don't require kibus begadim, you do require tevila. Makom shetaun kibus, eino din shetaun tevila. It goes without saying that what? That in a place where you would have to immerse your clothing, you of course would what? Have to immerse your body as well. Therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here is that Lamaisa, when Moshe tells the people, launder your clothing, which I will say means immerse your clothing in a mikvah. If you have to immerse your clothing, you certainly have to what? You certainly have to immerse your body. So what do you see from here? That there was a full body immersion prior to Matan Torah. What was the purpose of that full body immersion? The Pashas, that was for conversion purposes. What do you see from here? That even by the male ancestors, it was the immersion that affected conversion. To which the Gemara says, "V'dilma nekiyus ba'alma." How do you know that? Maybe when Moshe Rabbeinu says launder your clothing, he was saying just that. Launder your clothing. Maybe this is not immersion in the mikvah, but maybe this is just again nikiyus, simple cleanliness. Rather, we learn an immersion from here. Vayikach Moshe es hadam vayizrok ala'am. To say again by Sinaitic revelation, Moshe Rabbeinu took the blood of the sacrifices and he sprinkled it on the people. Ugemiri, and we have a tradition, de'ein hazah below tevila. That Rabbi say any sprinkling of sacrificial blood is always preceded by what? Always preceded by immersion in the mikvah. Okay, so we'll say what the Gemara is suggesting over here, and again, without an explicit proof, but almost from a circumstantial proof, is that there must have been tevilah. Because there must have been tevilah, perhaps everyone would agree that tevilah by itself, even without milah, is able to affect conversion. Rabbi Yoshua, tevilah beimos minalan. Where does Rabbi Yoshua know that our female ancestors ultimately immersed for conversion purposes? Svarahu, it's just logic. Why? De'im kain b'ma nichnesu tachas kanfei hashchina. If they did not immerse in a mikvah, then how exactly did they affect their conversion? Meaning, how exactly did they enter into the covenant with God? Amr Rabbi Chiya bar Amr Rabbi Yochanan. Li'olam eino ger. So we'll say now, after this whole discussion, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Chachamim, Rabbi Chiya says, listen guys, here's the halacha, you are not a convert until you have both milah as well as tevilah. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that kind of obvious? Yachid v'rab halach kiram, because also remember we have a three machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and the Chachamim. So whenever you have a dispute between individuals and a collective, a larger group, a rabbim, the halacha always follows the rabbim. We assume that the Chachamim are a group. Therefore, the Maisa, again, their opinion is going to outweigh the opinion of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua. To which the Gemara says, no. Man Chachamim, who is the Chachamim? Rabbi Yossi. Interestingly enough, from both sides, the Chacham over here reflects the view of Rabbi Yossi. Disanya. Hari shebav amar malti velo tavalti. Listen to this, Bryce. Also, let's say a person shows up and says, I'm Jewish. I went ahead and I did circumcision, but I did not do tevilah. So the Gemara says, Mat bilanoso. We have him go to the mikvah. Uma bikach. And who cares? Div Rabbi Huda. Now, what does that mean? We have him go to the mikveh, and who cares? Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, matbilin also. V'havi ki yisrael ma'alya ve'ein tzarich livdok be'edim im milas l'shem mitzvahs mila u'ma'bekach im ein milas l'shem mila ho v'tal b'tvilah sakah. So also listen to this. So Rabbi Huda is of the opinion that the ikar of conversion is tevila, is immersion in the mikveh. So what's the issue of us? The issue is like this: if a person shows up and says that I'm Jewish because I had a bris milah, remember, being circumcised is not evidence of Judaism. Why? Because if a person converts, the only time that the milah is effective is if it was done for the sake of gerus. Most this comes up all the time. Let's say a person was circumcised. It's not uncommon for a non-Jewish person to be circumcised. The person had a circumcision when they were a baby in the hospital. So what happens is they come to convert. So they say, oh, you have a bris milah, meaning because that circumcision that they had in their Gentile days, that's not effective for conversion. So what's happening over here is the guy shows up and says, oh, I already did a bris milah, I'm Jewish. So Rabbi Huda says the truth is what we do is we take him to the mikvah, and we have him immersed for the sake of conversion. We don't really care so much about his bris milah because bris milah is not the necessity for conversion. What matters most for conversion purposes is immersion, because as long as we are able to oversee immersion in the mikvah, we don't really care so much about the circumstances of his circumcision. Rabbi Yossi says, no, ein matbilin. We do not go ahead and immerse him. Now, what does that mean? Why not? Rashi says, "Ein matbilin shema aravi mahul v'givoni mahulu v'tzarach lahatif mimenu dam bris." Rabbi Yossi tarti boy. On the other hand, Rabbi Yossi says, "No. What are you talking about? First of all, again, just because he has a circumcision, again, lemaisa, that's not proof of Judaism." And Rabbi Yossi holds you can't just put him in the mikvah and move on, because lemaisa, at the end of the day, he requires both milah as well as tevila l'shem gerus. So first, we have to go in and take care of the milah. And Rabbi Yossi will see the way you take care of how can you do milah if somebody's already circumcised? So we do what's called hatafas dambris. We draw blood from the place of circumcision for the purpose of conversion. So Rabbi Yossi essentially says that lemaisa you need both milah and tevila. So when we say in mabdilin, it means we don't just quickly immerse him now. We need to do a milah for the sake of conversion, and then afterwards we could be tovim. So the point the Gemara is making over here is that you see that halacha l'mais Rabbi Yossi is the opinion who holds that you require both milah and tevila. Lefichach, therefore, again, lefichach matbilin ger b'Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Huda. Well, so you know what? Actually, we're gonna stop over here. We'll stop at lefichach. Okay, we have a lot to do tomorrow, but we'll pick up over here. Lefichach.